Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the 10th Anekdhara webinar series on an important topic on nature and national development. And we have three eminent personalities who will be addressing us, of which Mr. Sri Devender Singh will be the moderator. And we have Professors Mahesh Rangarajan and Professor Harini Nagendra who will be speaking, and then followed by discussion. So I will start the webinar session by introducing Professor Sri Devender Singh, and then later Sri Devender Singh will take over and introduce both the professors and take forward the webinar. Now, Sri Devender Singh, which we have known him since last 30 odd plus years, joined the civil services joined the civil services in 1986 in the Ministry of Railways in the Indian Railway Traffic Service. And he retired as, after having worked in a number of positions, he retired as the Principal Executive Director of Safety, which essentially entails to ensure safe running of trains across all zones of Indian Railways. That's a highly responsible position, and which is actually second in command with reference to the various operations. And in addition to that, more importantly, while in civil services, people do rise up, whether you are competent or not. The number of activities that he has undertaken indicates his competence. He earned GM's award twice, and then a number of DRM's awards. And then for the work he has done at Ghaziabad, it is mentioned in the Guinness Book of World Records, which is a very rare event for any civil servant, for that matter. But more importantly, his interests are much more diverse, which includes sports, both as a sportsman and a selector for Ranji Trophy team of Indian Railways in the past. And in addition to the sports, right now he is there as a moderator because of a keen interest in nature, photography, and also wildlife, moths, butterflies, and all these things. And he has written a number of articles on this, and is a member of a number of societies like Bombay Naturalist Society. So with this brief introduction of Devender Singh, I request Devender Singh to take over and take forward the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi, for introducing Anekdhara, and thank you, Anekdhara, for taking up this most relevant topic today. Nothing could be more relevant in today's date, because each one of us on this planet is directly or indirectly affected by the topic which you have chosen today. And means on this topic, what else we could have asked for? We have two stalwarts here. We have two very renowned personalities who will be throwing light on the most essential thing in our life today, which many a times we don't realize that it is most essential. Because it is said that nature and nation development, ecology and cities, that it is a saying that there are no free lunches in life, but in nature, what we are breathing is free of cost. We won't survive for 2.5 minutes or more. No webinar will be possible. Nothing would be possible if nature was not providing this essential, most essential thing in our lives of everyone, every living being on this planet. And water, which is almost free. So without taking much time, I would like to invite Professor Mahesh Rangarajan. He needs no introduction. One has heard him so much everywhere, and if I tell you the entire introduction, it will be a very long time. But Professor Mahesh is Professor of History and Environmental Studies in Ashoka Universities. He is a Rhodes Scholarship. He is a graduate alumni of Delhi University. He post-graduated from Oxford and has done wonderful job in his field of history and environment. Professor Mahesh Rangarajan is the first speaker, and I invite him to take the stage, please. Thank you.
Thank you. It's very embarrassing to be spoken of in these terms. These are very complex subjects. India is a country celebrating 75 years of independence. It became republic in 1950. but I am in a city which, if one accounts for the 7 cities of Delhi, is at least 1,000 years old. And in India, we like to think of ourselves as a 5,000-year-old civilization. The human species is hundreds of thousands of years old. And of course, life on Earth is millions of years old. So one has to approach this with some sense of humility. Part of that humility arises from the times we live in. The mid-20th century was a very important turning point in history. It marked the end of most destructive conflagration known to human race. And that conflagration ended with humans acquiring, some humans, the United States military to be specific, acquiring not only the power to drop an atomic bomb, but the power to annihilate life on Earth as we know it. Jonathan Shell uses a very important term on the ability to deploy nuclear weapons. He said their consequence would not only be the death of life, but the death of death. Impossible to grasp. But there's a larger sense it would mean the death of death, because it would not only mean death for those who are affected by the atomic weapon, but explosions, fission or fusion, whether in the atmosphere or in the ocean, lead to nuclear fallout. And in the 1940s, as you know, there was deep outcry at the use of the atomic weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's not as widely known that in the 1950s, due to a lot of work, scholars began to find that strontium-90 Ksm-37 were present in the bone marrow of every child, woman, and man on Earth. The Indian leadership, which had been known for the policy of ahimsa, non-violence, militant non-violence as a means to attain independence, then took up the issue of the nuclear fallout. And the then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru requested his former partner and very strong adversary, Rajaji, to lead a delegation to the White House. And at the end of the conversation on a nuclear test ban treaty, John Kennedy said that after listening to you, sir, I'm almost persuaded to drop my brief and join your side of the argument. I want to emphasize this because this is an extreme illustration of the conflict between what the scientist Barry Commoner in the 70s called the technosphere and what Devenji referred to this web of living things on the surface of the earth. There are living things in the earth which are in air, land, and sky. And all those living things, along with the material flows that sustain them, it's a very thin film of blue-green on the surface of the earth, which we call the biosphere. The biosphere is that which contains all life as we know it. And the relationships between these different living organisms and the biosphere is much more intimate than we earlier thought. One way to locate this conversation would be to remind ourselves that the mid-20th century not only saw new changes in terms of the technosphere. Historians nowadays use a term called the Anthropocene, which refers to the period when human activity, not all humans equally, but some humans more than others, acquired the power of a geological force. Sometimes this is dated to the start of the Industrial Revolution, let us say 1760, 1780. Others would argue it was the synthesis of ammonia because we changed the nature of the nitrogen cycle. So some say it was the carbon cycle, some say it was the nitrogen cycle. Others may argue it is because of the wave of mass extinctions. But there's a very important argument by the historian John McNeill, who argues that if you take the cumulative effect, 1945 may not be a bad idea, because whichever of these matrices you use, let's say greenhouse gases, over 75% of greenhouse gases extent have been emitted after 1945. And India's history as an independent nation state dates to the period after the Second World War. It coincided with the onset of the great acceleration in the time of the Anthropocene, the acceleration of technological economic growth with its attendant environmental consequences. It also came at a time of major political upheaval. The departure of the British forces from Gateway of India 6 months after independence heralded the beginning of a new era of the end of colonial empires of not only the British, but the French, the Dutch, and others across Asia and Africa. And the third, of course, which is very significant, is that this was also to be a period of new kinds of environmental awakening. I find the title of the larger seminar very interesting. It says nature and national development, can they go together? Well, in the mid-1940s, one of the challenges was how do you supplement political independence and complement it with economic independence. We all know there was a great debate through the 1910s to the 40s on what the road to economic independence was. We also know that a very particular set of choices was made in the 1940s and 50s to give special emphasis to heavy industry, to emphasize that without a core of heavy industry, that political independence, it would be impossible to sustain it with economic independence. My distinguished colleague Pulappe Balakrishna has just written a remarkable book called India's Economy from Nehru to Modi, where he shows that the period roughly from 50 to 65, India's economic growth rate was around 4%. So substantially more than the previous 50 years when it was less than 1%. It was, by the way, greater than China's growth rate. One important dimension of this is that many of the changes unleashed during the Second World War gathered force after the Second War. One of them was that in the course of the Second World War, the vast forest estate, India had a very large area of forest controlled by the State Forest Department, something like 600,000 square kilometers. This does not include areas of the princely states. After independence, they were also amalgamated to the forest areas. Many of these areas were seen as vital for agricultural expansion. And this marks a coincidence with the larger technological revolution. So along the skirt of the Himalayas, roughly from Western UP, right through Nepal and into Assam, there is the area of the Tarai, which historically was a place of very limited intensive human settlement because of the malarial mosquito. Well, along came DDT, new anti-malarial drugs, and due to the horrors of partition, a lot of refugees. And you find the Tarai opened up very rapidly. This was an extension of what were called the Grow More Food campaigns, which were part of the Second World War. So what in the Second World War was an imperial effort, clear the forest land, or in this case, the grassland, to expand agriculture. The uncultivated land simply seen as wasteland. It's a very, very important moment. Labor leader of the 40s, V.D. Giri, wrote a very famous pamphlet where he showed how we can bring the whole of the area of India under cultivation. Well, it's not possible. Only about half of the land area of India is cultivable, which is pretty good by historical standards. The other, of course, is that the forest was also seen as a source of industrial raw material. Professor Nagendra is from Bengaluru, but close to Bengaluru is Mysuru. Mysuru was the place of very important Indian. He won the Bharat Ratna after independence. Diwan Visvesvaraya. And M.S. Visvesvaraya wrote a very famous book, Industrialize or Perish. There's a Gandhian reply, the road India did not take. We can debate why, called Industrialize and Perish by Joseph Cornelius Kumarappa. But to go back to Visvesvaraya, the ISCO steel plant was actually a wood-fired steel plant. And the later steel plants and iron plants would be fired not by wood, but by compressed carbon, i.e. coal. So I think we need to keep in mind that in the 50s and 60s, forests were seen as critical as raw material for industries such as pulp and paper, because it was seen as vital for industry. And in the Indian model, it was both private and public sector. We look at a dam like Rihan, where many people were displaced. One of the few political leaders who picked up their issue and continued writing on it from the 50s till his death in the 80s was Chaudhary Charan Singh. There's an entire chapter in his biography called Big Dams and Big Projects, and it's about displacement. But I think in the 50s, this was not seen as vital. So the absence of rights in the forest, the absence of rights when you're displaced, actually facilitated industrialization. It did not mean the same for the people who lost their livelihood or lives. But I think it is important to keep this in some historical context. One of the famous speeches of Jawaharlal Nehru was made, two speeches in Bhakra and Nangal at the time of their inauguration. It's one of the most misquoted speeches in history because he said we are building temples of modern India. And some young colleagues, all of us are young, of course, in heart, like to say that, Nehru was against the small dams. If you read the speech, there is no reference to big and small. It actually is a speech in a very important province of India, Punjab, which saw some of the most horrific massacres of partition. Punjab, as you know, is the home of three great faiths: Sikhism, birthplace; Islam, very important; and of course, Hinduism. It's no coincidence he refers to this dam as greater than the biggest mosque, the biggest temple, the biggest Gurudwara. It's a civilian project. At the time, the largest earth masonry dam on earth. And most of the people working in it, the engineers, barring the head, were Indians. And this dam is to be seen along with the building of the new city of Chandigarh. So the Bhakra and Nangal dams, which tame the river, and the building of this modern industrial garden, modern garden city, are also an attempt of Indians to showcase to the world that they're capable of modern projects. Remember in the 50s, people didn't think the country would get it right. They thought it would break up into many bits, but they also thought that all of these are European gifts to a barbaric Asian people. I think that the other way to look at dams is that the 6 to 8 big dams which are built, a major product of them was hydropower. But the other, and I think is very important because of Bakra and Nangal, was irrigation water. Because as you perhaps know, along with the reservation of forests, which meant a lot of untold hardships for shifting cultivators, grazers, peasants in the British period, there were also initiatives to build a lot of canals. And today, Pakistan has the highest area of irrigated land per capita on earth. But those lands were lost. And the irrigation of what later became Punjab, Haryana, West UP was enabled by these dams. So I think we need to bear in mind that in the first 20 to 22 years after independence, roughly from the late 40s to late 60s, there was a free-for-all for nature. It was seen as vital for industrialization. There's a course correction in the late 60s, early 70s for a variety of reasons. There were a number of grassroots movements. Some are very well known. In North India, there was the Chipko Andolan in the hill areas, foothills of what was then UP. It was a conflict between forests for livelihood, ash trees to be specific, and forests for industry. The slogan of the Chipko Andolan, which came up very well written in the new wonderful book by Shekhar Pathak. Those who would like to read fat, big books, there's a 600-page version in Hindi, and there's an elegantly written version in English, in which he shows that women and students and very poor cultivators were at the forefront of this movement. And it took this Gandhian slogan and asked, Aaj Himalay ki lalkar one par gaon ka adhikar. The Himalay's cry today is that the village should rule the forest. It is equally important that the forest department slogan at the time was Kya hai jungle ke upkar, Lisa, Lakdi aur Vyapar, which means what do forests bear? Timber, Lisa, Lakdi aur Vyapar, timber, resin, timber, and trade. So there is a sort of economic logic which is running into a livelihood and ecological logic. One of the very important leaders of Chipko, who died tragically last year of COVID, Sundarlal Bahuguna, added another line. He said, jungle ke upkar, mitti, pani aur baya. What do forests bear? Water, oxygen, and soil. So this particular kind of impulse by the early 70s also is noticed by leadership. One should keep in mind India, unlike many of the newly independent Asian African countries, was and remains a democracy. And one of the features of democracy historically is that ideas filter not only from the grassroots, but there are many intermediate levels in which this happens. One of the very interesting books which has come out is by Jairam Ramesh, Indira, Life in Nature. And it's very striking in the 60s, the extent to which a new generation of naturalists, photographers, foresters, people in different walks of life who were interested in the question of nature, of monuments, the protection of the architectural ancient monuments, were actually engaged in a lot of dialogue. And it is these that get drawn into the administrative political structure at the very top. This, of course, cannot be explained only in terms of personality. Mrs. Indira Gandhi listened with her left ear. She had her father had read Salim Ali in jail. She was president of the Birdwatcher Society, all true. A lot of it is conjuncture. So in the late 1940s, one of the conjunctures was modernization, industrialization. I would argue in the late 1960s, it was deep-seated agrarian crisis. It's difficult today to recognize the extent to which the twin rainfall failures of 65-66 came close to breaking the back of the Indian economy and the polity. India had to import 19 million tons of American grain, for which it did not have the foreign exchange. And this, of course, was in a country where irrigation coverage was limited. The pace of agricultural growth had been high, but the pace of progress had been higher. And more importantly, it is a time, along with the launch of the packaged measures known as green revolution, high yielding high use of water, chemical pesticides, fertilizers, with all their
Leslie,
attendant
please mute
problems
yourself.
surfaced. Along with that, there was a realization, or rather a assertion, that there was a relationship between forests, wildlife, sustaining the hydrological system. You see it with two very large animals, one of which debate. Excuse me, Leslie and Badri, could you please mute your mics? Thank you, sir. Sorry. You see it in Gujarat, where there was concern about the protection of the lion. And the protection of the lion would be seen not only as important for the pride of Gujarat, it became state in 19th century, but also in terms of the forest being one of the very large natural forests left in the state, from a hunting reserve, of course, of the Nawab of Gujarat. Similarly, in the case of the tiger, the launch of Project Tiger 1973 was a very large concept. But again, the tiger was seen as a keeper of the order in the forest by controlling the number of deer, and being a friend to the farmer. So around this time that a very important step was taken to ban snake skinning. There are a lot of figures. So 50 years on, I would argue that in the early 70s and through the 80s. So I think looking back 50 years, it is true that in the 70s and 80s, a range of measures, I'm not getting into details of states, just to mention the Wildlife Protection Act, the Forest Conservation Act, the Environment Protection Act, legislation on water and air, and a number of attendant measures put into place some ways of moderating the impact of development on the environment. It's a very important debate on what kinds of development are more and less harmful to the environment, which of course brings us to a very interesting question on what is and is not the environment. Where does nature begin and end? And some of the changes in this period are significant. There's a debate on large dams, whether small dams are better, whether large dams should be built everywhere, whether we should think about where we are building them. One of the very important movements was in Silent Valley, Kerala, and the dam was finally not built. It was a sign of increased ecological consciousness because the intrinsic scientific worth of this valley was seen as very important. Similarly, there was the reshaping of Naval Boys Training School. I'm sorry, that's what they called it, in Chilika Lake in Odisha. But I think it would be true to say that there were very important human concerns, which actually got accentuated because of the kinds of conservation that were attempted. I referred to Project Tiger and such issues, and displacement of people due to these parks and reserves led to very important assertions and movements in the 90s. So by the early 2000s, the Forest Rights Act tried to address some of these concerns. Similarly, with dams, it's estimated some 20 million people were displaced by dams. And the Act of 2013 on rehabilitation, for the first time, recognized rights of those who are displaced. So this, just to end on a question, this question of the technosphere and biosphere is a global question. It has a very particular kind of significance in a developing country. We know the per capita income in India is $2,000 compared to China, which is 6 times what India is, or 5 times. And the United States, just to remind ourselves, which is 35 times. However, India is still a country which is not only of 1.3 to 4 billion people, it's also home to 25,000 varieties of flowering plants, about as many other varieties of plants, over 500 mammals, 1,000 birds, 1,000 varieties of fish. And one of the ideas of the ecological awakening is that the notion of the nation has space for them as well. But how do you make space for them in a country where technological modernization and expansion is happening at this kind of pace? And one way to do that, of course, is to draw on science. It's to draw on the experience of democratic ways of functioning. The democracy provided checks and balances in the past. Will they endure? And will they endure at a time when there are global changes, which I referred to at the beginning, which have gathered pace? And at a time when India is a very different country from 1972. You know, just to end on this, in late 60s, 2/3 of the traction power on farm came from bullocks. Before Congress split, Congress election symbol also was 2 bullocks with a plow. Then it changed. Today, 2/3 of the traction power comes from the tractor. And we have a good friend who will not, I'm not going to name, very outspoken person on alternatives. When I argued once that the tractor reduced the amount of demand for forage and reduced the size of the cattle herd because they are not required for traction, I was quite rightly asked, what about the environmental cost of the tractor in terms of fossil fuels, environmental footprint, the materials that are used to build the tractor? And these are very difficult questions. I don't think there is one answer, but a combination of science, democracy, and the livelihood and lived practices on the ground may make India a place where we begin to pose the questions in a more productive way, even though the challenges in the next 50 to 75 years will probably be more complex than the period we have passed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mahesh. What a wonderful journey you have, introduced us to from 1940s until 2022. There are many issues which you have raised, and we can reserve those at the end of the discussion if there are any questions. And thank you very much for enriching with such a beautiful thought and such wide and diverse point of views in every field which is connected with nature and nation development and its history and ecology. Thank you so much. And I would like to invite Professor Harini Nagendra, who is a stalwart in her own way and a prominent figure. She is the director of Research Center and Center for Climate Change and Sustainability in Azim Premji University. And she has written many books. I am one of the persons who possess one of your books, which are beautifully written, and winner of many overseas awards. She's a columnist. She's an authority in urbanization and ecology and sustainability. I would invite Professor Harini Nagendra to please take over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. And it's an honor to speak here and also to follow Professor Rangarajan's talk, which I think lays out this large landscape. I have a presentation, and as we were discussing for the audience, we have somewhat different presentation styles. So I hope you'll bear with me when I take us on to series of slides. Just give me a second, please. I'll just share my. So I am thinking of, so I'm going to talk about the transition that we have seen with reference to cities and with reference to some of my work on Bangalore in the past 15, 16 years. But first I wanted to set the context, since we're talking really about global and nationwide issues. So we are in the middle of a massive urban transition. We're in the era that, as Professor Rangarajan said, of the Anthropocene. And this is a new geological era that geologists have also agreed defines a new point in our life where what has happened in this compressed period of time and what is going to happen in the next few 20, 30, 40 years is going to be hugely shaped by humans, and which is why it is called the era of the Anthropocene. The era of the Anthropocene is also often called the era of the urban. This is a nightlight satellite image of the world, and of course, the only people who switch on their cities at their lights at night are people in cities. And you can see this gives you a snapshot of where the cities are, and you will see that India is fairly brightly lit. Already, we are a world that is more than 50% urban. India is still 1/3 urban only, but even India will be projections indicate more than 50% urban by 2050. And the world itself will probably go from 50% urban to 75% urban by 2050. So for the first time, we are entering this large transition where we're moving from a predominantly rural way of life to a predominantly urban way of life. And of course, we know that comes with a very intense footprint. Here is another UN chart from 2014, which shows you the growth rate of the city population. So the reds and the yellows are fast-growing cities. And the larger the size of the circle or dot or square or whatever it is indicates the largest the city. And you can see that the growth, the urbanization of the future is really dominated by China and India and large parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And the largest, 3 of the world's 10 largest cities are in India, but 3 of the world's 10 fastest urbanizing cities are also in India. So we are really going to reshape the urbanization of the world, and this urbanization is dominated by India. One of the studies I did with colleagues in different parts of the world, we were looking at what are the kinds of literature we have on urban sustainability, scientific literature. And if we looked at 1,000 papers over a 10-year period, which are the top cited papers in the area of urban sustainability. And what we found was 0.5% of these 1,000 papers, so 10 papers out of 1,000 came from India. Another maybe 40 papers came from India-like context, South Africa and similar contexts. So 0.5% of the literature on these issues comes from our parts of the world, and yet our parts of the world are the ones that are fast changing. China is a completely aberrant in this data, because they do fund a lot of research and do a lot of research on Chinese cities, which is sometimes published in Mandarin and in local language, in local journal magazines and research publications. But a lot of it is also available in international publications. So set China aside in terms of developing countries, but look at India, South Africa and countries like that. You have 0.5% of the literature comes from these. And this is important because scientific literature that is highly cited drives our plans, our policies, our methods, our ways of seeing, our ways of investigating and analyzing the city. And that means we are driven by an understanding that comes from cities like New York or Paris or places like that. But of course, our processes are very different. And we know that cities are engines of prosperity and promise, which is why people move to them. But cities are also, this is the reality. You have water pollution, frothing and foaming. This is Bengaluru Lake in Bangalore, which is famous or infamous every year because its foam catches fire. You have people living in the worst of heat waves in these shanties with tin roofs. You have flooding. As we speak, Pakistan is facing devastating flooding. And this is going to be something that Indian cities will deal with very regularly, but many cities across the world. And of course, you have air pollution. As you can see from this photograph of Hyderabad, this is very early in the morning, and I took it about 10 years ago, but it was already getting very smog-filled. Right? So cities can't survive if they ignore ecology. And I want to stress this very importantly, because very often when you talk to people about cities and ecology, they don't think they go together. You are told that people will move to cities because it is inevitable, and we will lose trees, we will lose lakes, we cannot afford to think about nature in cities because it's an inevitable casualty. People have to progress. You can save forests. That's outside the city. Leave the land in the city for the roads and the buildings and the cars and the people. But if you don't have nature, you don't have clean air, you don't have clean water, you can't live physically healthily. And I think COVID has really taught us that. Also, in terms of mental health, we saw in COVID lockdown times how much we all depended on nature for our basic sanity and well-being. So urban ecosystems are extraordinarily important, and we can't afford to think of cities without nature. This is some of my writing on nature in the city and trees of Indian cities. So as an ecologist who started looking at biodiversity, wildlife, conservation issues from about 1993 onwards, I moved to cities late. I would say I'm a relatively recent entrant in this area, starting looking at urban ecology in 2006. And that was because I felt that nature in the city falls through a gap when we're looking at change. Because ecologists don't like studying places like cities because they're not sufficiently glamorous. We like to be out in rural areas of distant forests away from people. And people who study cities don't think ecology is important. You have excellent books on cities and you don't none of them talk about ecology. And think of Maximum City or think of the lovely books on Ahmedabad or on Delhi. And people don't discuss ecology. They very rarely do they. So I'm from Bangalore. A lot of my work on cities is on Bangalore. A little bit that I want to give you on the flavor of what kind of changes you get in Bangalore, but I would like to pull in other cities. So this is a map of Bangalore, and you can see that maroon area right in the center is the market town of Bangalore, which Kempegowda built in 1537, and it has expanded hugely since then. But what of the landscape before Kempegoda? Bangalore is an unusually ancient civilization. We have megalithic stone tombs that when menhirs, which will tell you that the landscape was populated about maybe 3000 CE. So it has continuous human habitation for at least 5000 years. But it is semi-arid. It's in the rain shadow of the Western Ghats. It does not get too much rainfall. Though it's on a plateau, it's not as hot as the surroundings. It is in a landscape because it's semi-arid, had very few trees. It has no perennial water sources. So what is an ancient civilization with water doing in a place, I mean, without water doing? Because we know, as we know that, most people come where there is water and they follow the water courses. So what did people do in these areas? We have no idea what they did in the people who built the megalithic stone tombs. We have no idea how they lived without water. But we get some clues to about 5th century CE onwards, when people start leaving inscriptions on stone and on copper plates documenting how they came in. And this is an example from the Hoysala dynasty. What they did, as they did across peninsular South India, was to go to natural depressions in the ground, scoop out the mud and create tanks, which we now call lakes, which was stores of water. So that is how people came into the landscape. They improved the landscape from the point of view of ecology to make it habitable for humans. They created water bodies, they linked them through topographic channels, which we call caloways, which we today call drains. So you can see how from that word that we use drain, how we now think of it as a Ganga Nala, for instance, as we talk about in Delhi, Najafgarh. But these were really not drains, they were rainwater channels that actually transported clean flowing water and kept the ecosystem going. And people planted trees to improve the quality of the environment for them. So this was the case through up till Kempegoda came. Kempegoda started the market town. This continued through the his various descendants, and then the city passed through turbulent time. You had Shivaji's father Shahji, you had the Mughals, you had the Mysore kings, then you had Hyder and Tipu. Everybody attended to planting trees and taking care of the lakes and the wells and the water systems, because they knew that they couldn't survive without that. And here's an example of an inscription from Kempapura, which talks about the way they imagined these areas. These are essentially land grants. And when they talk about the land grant, they talk about the wells underground and the trees overground. You will not see this in a single land grant document today. The idea that a well underground is part of the land or the trees overground are part of the land. First thing we do is fill in the wells and cut down the trees and then build. But I think these people in the past knew the importance of these, of keeping nature in the city for survival, for building these landscapes. Similarly, Shiva Bharat, which is Shahji's court poet talking about Bangalore in the 1640s, talks about a city which was animated by calls of peafowl, describes a city with deep lakes, fountains, trees thick with flower and shade, a landscape dotted with counted lakes and parks festooned with creepers. And Shahji ruled here like Indra in his paradise. So Bangalore was like paradise for Shahji. This continues till 1791 when the British first come into the city, and you can see a city of lakes. You can see a city where trees are on roads and around the city, the native city part, which is the Pete. And by 1888, as the British now take over, they add more waterscapes, they plant many more trees. But by 2015, you start seeing a change. You see a dramatic change. That is, all the lakes and water bodies in the heart of the city have disappeared, though the trees still remain. And of course, from about 1999, 2000, the trees also start getting cut. We have lost lakhs of trees. We're going to lose lakhs more. And it's ironic that cities across India are talking about dealing with the realities of climate change while we're busy filling in our wetlands, destroying our mangroves, and cutting down our trees. So what happened alongside this is a change in the way people related to nature. And though we were in cities which had diverse values for ecosystems and biodiversity, for instance, women foraging for wild greens on the bottom of a dry lake, or Gundatops, as you can see next to her, this photograph, which are these forests that were really village commons that were planted with jackfruit and mango and useful trees that people could graze in, or the cattle grazers and fishers and hobbies who were an integral part of this entire lake system. As we start restoring lakes, all of these uses are banned. The women who forage are thrown out, the men who wash their cattle are not allowed, the hobbies are not allowed, the fishers are not allowed. Similarly, we used to have wooded streets with vibrant street life. This is KR Road in Bangalore, very famous road, and this is in the 1930s. They had beautiful trees, they had street vendors, and it was a very vibrant way of life. And now all the trees look like this. I mean, all the roads look like this, completely barren, devoid of trees, devoid of street vendors, and less safe for people. You know, the KR Road of before was safe for a woman to walk late at night because there were street vendors and there was a thriving street life. But in this kind of a road where there are no street vendors and there is only traffic, when the traffic comes down, it becomes a high crime zone. Not just the people like us who get impacted by pollution, but street vendors are very critically impacted. And a student of mine was doing this, Sukanya Basu did a study on Hyderabad looking at street vendors. And they spoke about the challenges. One woman said, I was very comfortably located under a huge tree for 12 years, but because of the metro construction, I had to shift to this place which doesn't have trees. I feel I get a headache. There was a man who described saying having trees is having sukoon. And he said, when I lost the trees, I lost my sukoon. And what can I do? This is my fate. If I look for trees, I won't get customers. Right? And so these are the people who we never talk about as having a right to the city. And I think increasingly as Indian cities grow hotter, a right to shade is going to be very important. That's the street as a public space. But if you look across the city, and I'm just giving you one example of the complete end of it as private space and home gardens. Our home gardens in Bangalore was always a city of bungalows, and they had these very biodiverse home gardens where you had creepers that would have beans and lentils and other kinds of plants that were always edible. And now they've moved to apartments where you have manicured lawns and exotic palms, and not a single edible tree is inside, either on the streets or in our homes. Yet we still find that urban foraging is alive and active in the heart of Bangalore. So we did a study of 200 women from low-income families, and 47% of them either forage for their own food or buy forage species in a market. That is, they pay someone else to forage for them, and 42% would like to forage more. They knew, 202 women knew about 76 different species, which we had no clue of. We have a little book coming out called Chasing Soppu, which actually talks, Soppu being greens in Bangalore, which talks about these kinds of greens. So women like these often live in informal settlements that we call slums, and that is where you still have these local species that are planted, which they use as their daily diets, for their medicines, for other kinds of places. So slums are a very important place for conservation in cities like Bangalore. Fishers are an important source of local knowledge, so are grazers, and yet so are sacred spaces, whether they're mosques or churches or cemeteries or temples. They are where we have ants and birds fed, roosting sites protected, monkeys protected, ant hills are protected across diverse faiths. And common spaces, all of these are common spaces. And a planting space in a slum is a commons which anybody from the community can use. A lake, a restored lake, is a commons which anyone can use. Here is Eleanor Ostrom, with whom I had the privilege for working for several years before she passed away. 2009 Economics Nobel Prize laureate, planting a jackfruit tree at one of the lakes in Bangalore in recognition of the commons. And the lake, the tree still survives, and the fruits are eaten by the community. Now, why are these kinds of spaces important? What I'm calling commons or community spaces, or this idea that everybody should be included, whether it's a migrant worker or someone picking flowers and leaves, or grazers and fishers. We did some studies looking at restored lakes. Now, the challenge that Indian cities face is migrants. You're going to be, the kinds of growth that they're facing is already explosive and is going to become even more explosive in the future. And you have lakhs of people coming in some cities like Bombay. There are estimates that 1 lakh plus or even more possibly now come in every day. Right? So if you're thinking of a city of that kind, how do you get these migrants feeling that this city is theirs and therefore being part of the city and working towards some kind of conservation or any social action in the city? What we found was restored places of nature have an important role to play in changing people's mindsets. So it could be the migrants that you see above, the migrant workers at this lake. They come with a young boy and they're willing to take a price cut of 1,000 rupees less of salary every month, because just like us, they want their children to grow up in healthy environments. Or the woman below, who was part of a village next to the lake, she calls herself the lake's Dattaputri. And the lake has transformed. But she was able to tell us about 11 different wells across the lake and these connections to the hydrology of the landscape. Similarly, we had a mother of a differently able child, or corporate employees, or transgender people, diverse people from very different backgrounds, extremely wealthy to extremely poor, marginalized like the transgender people, or highly powerful people living in this landscape, who all tell us that they feel part of Bangalore because they can come to the lake every day, they see a tree that reminds them of their home, they see a bird that reminds them of their home. And because of that, these people get together and become a part of place making, of environmental action. It could be teaching kids in government schools, it could be planting food landscapes, it could be agitating for better traffic infrastructure or cycling, all kinds of things. So in conclusion, what does all of this disparate work tells us? That we're going to have urbanization, therefore we will have cities, and cities are here to not just to stay but to grow. So our question is not should we have cities, how can we be sustainable in India with cities, but how can we live with cities to be a little more sustainable than we are currently? I think that is unfortunately a conundrum today. So often when I give talks like this, people ask me about cities are not sustainable, we should have strengthen rural India. Yes, that is absolutely true. I think we should strengthen rural India, but I think we can't close our eyes to the fact that urbanization is not just inevitable and ongoing, but it will accelerate. And we can't have people living well in cities without nature in cities. Now, the challenge is we have so much focused on the ecology of this that we are forgetting the culture of living with cities. And we find from our work in not just in Bangalore, but in Delhi and Hyderabad and Kolkata and many other cities, that some of the places where nature thrives are the places we ignore, the sacred spaces, the slum, the informal settlements, the way in which street vendors interact with biodiversity. These are the places that we need to work with to actually strengthen ecology. And we tend to think of these as pristine landscapes. Professor Rangarajan was talking about the protected areas. We need to move that. We have actually moved that concept of inviolate spaces. That's how we manage our protected areas, to cities and saying throw the people out. It didn't work in the rural areas. It does not work in cities. Unless we recognize local foraging, local cultural and spiritual values, we can't hope to protect urban ecosystems. And we must realize that these are commons, which are community spaces where everyone needs to interact. So I'll end with this very beautiful slide that I never tire of looking for. Rohit Rao was an undergraduate student who interned with us. And he drew this sketch of what his idea of an ecologically smart city would be, where people interact with nature in multiple forms. You can see people foraging, you can see someone taking his baby, an auto rickshaw driver, a woman selling street vendors, people living in apartments with potted lawns. It's just a beautiful idea of the city with its animals and its birds and its wildlife, and the people integrally part of nature. And I think these are the kinds of cities we have in reality. And these are the cities we need to plan for, because unless unfortunately, our planning excludes the people from this nature. So we can't hope to survive unless we actually fix this conundrum. So with that, let me stop sharing.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Harini. What a beautiful way to describe, that the urbanization is so essential, but we have to be very conscious of ecology. It is interdependent. And you have brought out such a beautiful way, the presentation, that all of us are initiated into, self-introspection, and that what actually is to be done. There are challenges, as Professor Mahesh also said, that there has to be a balance between nature and nation development, because for nothing else, but because of the survival of the nation and survival of the population and survive as a human. And it has got all aspects to it: economic development, political development, cultural development, ethical development, and for good health, for living as a human being. And as someone said, that there is enough in this world for everyone's need, but not for one man's greed. So there are many things which are to be taken into consideration. And both the presentations, both the speakers have really initiated a thought-provoking action in all the minds who are listening to the presentations and who are viewer of this presentation. And one more thing which Professor Harini has brought out, that there is a way forward. The most important thing about the nature, ecology, development of nation development or the development as a whole, that awareness has to spread. She has taken the example of the Bangalore city. This is the story of every city in the world, every city in our country, that some part of the population is aware of the significance of nature. Some part of the population is just not aware. And that awareness has to be spread. And this particular session, which is going on, will go a long way. Whosoever is listening to it, it will be duty of everyone to spread it further, to make it possible, because it should not be an academic exercise. It has to take practical shape. And you know, there are so many things which are to be balanced in a developing country. Like Professor Mahesh said, that you know, our economy, we are only having a per capita income of $2,000. There are other countries which are much more advanced and much more prosperous. And 72,000 children are born every day in our country. So they have to have their space, and the space is limited. The boundaries cannot be expanded. So what to do? So there has to be a balance. And with the planned development, aware development, and things which can be taken into practical reality, so that development and nature both can survive simultaneously. And which, as I said earlier also, that COVID last 2 years have amply shown that lifestyles are expensive, living is very, it's not, is inexpensive. And if we give chance to nature, it can regenerate. It has a tremendous power to regenerate. One could see Himalayas from Saharanpur and Jalandhar. It was a sight, unbelievable sight, and it will never happen. It never happened. I will never see it again. So if we control ourselves in such a manner that development and nature, ecology and sustainability can be taken together. And the urban landscape, which Professor Harini spoke about, this has to come in a form that every city has to adapt according to its needs. And it has to be an all-round development. It has to be, it can't be driven through only laws, awareness, culture awareness, the significance of the trees and forests. If I calculate in economic terms that each one of us, like we have a debt servicing, we have an EMI due for our houses, for our vehicles, for our equipments. I think each one of us is having 150 crore EMI due to nature, because 550 the liters of oxygen you are taking every day. And how many of us are giving it back to nature? Well, our actions. So actions have to come at macro level, at micro level, at microscopic level. What each one of us who is listening today can do. If you are bathing with 2 buckets of water, you can reduce it to 1. If you are wasting electricity, you can reduce. If you are not planting trees or not taking care of the trees, not taking care of the greenery around you, or not helping someone when you can help, this will enable us to further develop ourselves as well as conserve nature. And as they say that no one is going to swim alone or sink alone. All of us will either swim or sink together. And every one of us is into it completely. And with these words, I would throw open the discussion for any questions which the audience has so that it can be answered by the two experts. Professor Harini, there is a question that what is the planning and legal mandate required to set up an ecological sensitive city and also for citizens? Professor.
It is, yeah, I was sorry, I was not allowed to I think unmute, which I recognize why. So yes, thank you. I think that's a very interesting question. I think the follow-up question is who will be doing it? Yes, you're absolutely right. I think the challenge is really with all the kind of legislations we have, how do you set up an eco-sensitive or ecologically sensitive city? It becomes harder and harder. I'll give you the example of Bangalore again. We are not unusual in having a national park at our boundaries, Bannerghatta National Park, and the buffer zone or the eco-sensitive zone around it was first much larger. Then it was reduced to 30 kilometers, 10 kilometers, and finally now has shrunk to 1 kilometer. At the same time, the metro line is going very close to the park for various reasons, and so which obviously means that urban growth is directed. You have a highway that is stretching, that is very close to the park on two sides. You have a metro that is going there. You have a lot of land prices escalating. And so the urban growth, the planners that are planning urban growth of the city are directing it along these corridors, and one of the corridors takes it right there. At the same time, the park authorities want to manage the park and are forced to reduce the eco-sensitive zone. So what are you planning ecologically sensitive cities for? I don't think we can do this in terms of even planning our protected areas unless we plan these cities. Of course, there is the Town Planning and Act, which mandates certain things like so much percentage of the areas open spaces, etc. But and it also mandates that local ward councillors will have a say, and this is the kind of development that you want in your area should be driven by ward committees. But we know that that is not really mandated or followed in practice, even in cases like Bangalore, where the court has mandated it and ward committees have been set up, they are largely not being able to be functional. So I think it is more than the actual policies. I think to some extent the policies are in place, the legal mandates or planning might be in place, but somewhere, as it often happens, the slip between the legal mandate and the actual execution and the processes that dictate how it is executed lead to a lot of slips. And always when you're balancing multiple priorities, nature is the one that always gets this bottom of the priority list.
Thank you. Professor Mahesh, there is a question for you. Historical evolution of Adivasis and their relationship with the forest as per law and in practice. And the other part of the question which can be linked to it is, isn't the rich dwellers' inability to understand the environmental sustainability because of their inability to understand the interconnected nature of humans themselves?
The first is easier to locate historically. In the late 19th century on, there is a enclosure of a lot of the rural open access areas and commons. Much of this was taken up by the forest department. Everybody here would be familiar with the story of Mowgli, Rudyard Kipling. So many of you have been distinguished IAS officers. You may be interested to know what Mowgli did when he grew up. According to Kipling, he became a forest guard. And since many of you are railway officers, Kipling said forest service is most important service in Raj, other than army. Because the young foresters, they chase away the goats who eat the saplings. And the boys trained in Nancy and in Prussia, they know that the saplings have to grow up to be mighty trees, which will provide timber for sleepers to railways, on which soldiers will go out to crush the rebellions. So railways is what today will be called, if you want to put investment, suppose you have 1 crore, 10 crore, 1,000 crore, 5,000 crore, where would you put it? So if it was 1850, you would buy railway bonds. You would invest in the railway companies. So Daniel Thorner showed railway companies is what today will be called private-public partnership. That is, the railways are built by private companies. They raise money on the London stock market, and the rate of return is guaranteed. And the land for railways is acquired by government. And finally, in 1892, there is Land Acquisition Act. There is no right of the person whose land is acquired. I want to underline this. So the loss of rights in forest and loss of rights in land are linked. Loss of rights in forest is the creation of the forest estate. Adivasi rights were extinguished, or where they continued, they become degraded from rights to privileges, to customs, to crimes. One. And this largely continues after independence because this is seen as important for the national interest. 1952 National Forest Policy says national interest overrides local interest. It's a remarkable book by a very great sociologist who is no more with us, Manorama Sabur, When the Bamboo Flowers in Indian Forests. It's a very scary book. She shows where there are bamboo mills, the paper mills, the bamboo is extinguished in an area around it. Reason is preferential pricing. So to quote area where I did work with a very interesting group in 80s, the Shardol group, they showed that the Shardol plant Orient paper mill owned by one of the then two biggest industrial families, now one of the four biggest industrial families. You can find out which one. They bought the bamboo at 1 rupee per ton. It was sold in market at 600 per ton and Adivasis brought it at 1200 per ton. So there you are. That's one. Second part, and I think this is much more serious, that these enclosures are continuing and the people dependent on them are resisting it. In a democracy, there are many means of resistance which are non-violent. So one of the great cause célèbres recent years was the Nayamgiri case, Dongaria courts, who went to they were able to secure it because of the Forest Rights Act. Forest Rights Act, under the rules, not the law, mandated that Gram Sabha consent was required. They said, we have not even had a Gram Sabha. Where has this consent come from? And they won the case. But that rule has recently been changed. So, we're all saying very nice things. We're all trying to find out who are the losers. Okay, Adivasis are losers, marginal peoples are losers. Now new work shows people of menial manual castes are losers, women are losers. But there are winners. The winners are the key. It's not the losers. And history is a story of successful sociological experiments of winners. And I think that the transformation of nature, the ecological transformation and modernization, which is done in the name of the nation, earlier done in the name of empire, there are winners. The winners will say all the right things. We are all winners. I am sitting in an area which is formerly riverbed. The bund protects us and it's a housing colony. So the winners are, in the last 12 years particularly, not only in India, across the world, leading a charge to dilute whatever environmental regulation exists. Best instance is former President of the United States, Donald Trump. He says outrageous things. He's only an extreme case. There's a counterpart in every country and at every level. And the reality is that, when I think Professor Nagendra said it very diplomatically, I'll try to also be very diplomatic, that you see, the metro authority overrides the forest authority. The building interests along the Banerghatta are stronger than those who want to protect it. So if this is to be an issue of science, we shouldn't have too much of a problem. But it is actually an issue of society, politics, economics. So there's a larger question. And I'm sorry, one of the later questions says, is this development? I'll put it to you, and I don't have an answer as a student of history. See, in Delhi in 1950s, 3,000 people died in the jaundice epidemic. There was a lot of study and some changes were made in the water system. 1980s, many people died in a cholera epidemic. Prime Minister even visited some of the slums and so on. Now, I think 12 of the most polluted urban air polluted cities are in India. 12 of the 20. In many of them, 15, 20, 25% of the children are ill at some time of the year. Old people are ill some time of the year. It's not a major political issue. Why? I don't have an answer. Or if it is an issue, there are other concerns which trump it. So what is the way in which we take this up in a manner that influences policy is actually a question about what are the interests and priorities which are overriding this livable, safe, productive, I was writing nice words, safe, habitable, productive, water retentive, shade inclusive environment. What are who doesn't need these, or who feels this should be 10th or 10th priority? That is the real question. And I think democracies have been very good for liberty. But in the democracy for equality, we should look at environmental entitlement. Entitlement to a safe, habitable, productive environment is part of democracy. And democracies have succeeded and failed in this to varying degrees. We were looking like we could succeed on some of them, but it's not so sure anymore. Sorry, it's a long answer.
Thank you, Professor Mahesh. And one more question which someone has asked, that why our culture considers river as mother and trees and animals, even inanimate, as divine? And, and we abuse them so recklessly, so careless about environment. And I have been, speaking on the subject that the environment can take place, can protect itself. It is the human greed, apathy, selfishness, and unawareness, which is responsible for a lot of, disbalanced or unbalanced development, or our thought process also, because it starts with a thought. Unless and until each individual is aware that what he is doing, what she is doing, it is very difficult to have, consequence, to pinpoint that what is the consequence of your action. So I would request Professor Harini to, say, answer this, or have some comment on that why rivers and trees and animals are considered as, mothers and sustainable and source of sustainability.
It's a very interesting question. If you look at some work that Professor Madhav Gadgil had done about 3-4 decades ago, along with another Professor Subhash Chandran from Kerala, they had looked at a number of places, and you see this across cities now in Bangalore. They had looked at rural areas where the idea of the sacred, once it transfers from nature to a built space, then the sacred gets sacrificed. So I'll give you an example, which we'll see in countless temples across India. First, there is a tree, a sacred tree, a peepal tree, a banyan tree, and then there is a stone that is worshipped below the tree, or maybe the tree itself is worshipped. Then it's a stone and a series of 7 stones. Then they put a small stone platform, 2 pieces of stone and then something on top. Then they build the community becomes a little more prosperous. They pull together money and build a room. Eventually what happens is that room becomes a temple. People start worshipping it, the idol inside, and then the tree gets in the way of expansion. So you cut the tree down. And then you have the temple, because the temple is sacred and the god or goddess within that which has been installed is now sacred, and the tree is no longer sacred. And this is something that you will actually see in location after location across India. And so this is, I think it is the idea. We had a system of inanimate nature worship, and it's not inanimate. We call it inanimate, but it's often personification of nature. In some places you will find that it stays. There's a very interesting tree near my house, which has a Devi staying there. And apparently when they had the highway that was going to pass through that area, they wrote a petition to the Devi and they put it in her, under her, in her little shrine. She has a little room, and they put it there, and they had a way of saying if a flower dropped off, she said yes, and if the flower remained, she said no, or something like that. But anyway, the Devi said, no, you cannot have the highway. I don't want to move. And so they actually got together and moved the highway. And I don't know of too many places, as Professor Rangarajan was saying, I think we should look at the successes to understand what works when the dominant signature is that of failure. And when a highway can be moved because of a Devi, which is actually a tree. I mean, really, this is a very large tree. And the contractor is Bihari. But the contractor apparently refused to put, and this is in Karnataka, to put the road in that area, and they had to actually move it to some extent because he didn't want to have the effects of the wrath of the Devi. So I think there are areas in which we can keep the sacred. There are areas in which we transfer that sacred either by moving it into a shrine or by moving the idea of nature into a lake. The same displacement happens in a lake. You take many of these lakes, they were sacred spaces, they were worshipped, there were various forms of Devis which are worshipped as Ganga or Parvati. But once you have the lake, what happens is urban uses, and you start walking around the lake and engaging with birds and wildlife, and you forget that it was a sacred space. And it's not so much the sacredness, but the type of sacredness, which really meant that you worship nature, not that you worship a Devi of this kind in this place, but you worship nature. So I think it's a very interesting balance to some extent that you see a lot of nature surviving in our built spaces because it is sacred, but you also find that that notion of the sacred is ephemeral in some places, and it can be transferred, it can be lost very quickly. And if we can get at a better understanding of how to preserve this, because this, in some sense, the sacredness is a non-denominational sacredness. People from all faiths will come and worship at that idea of the sacred. So if we can resurrect that idea, I think we have something very powerful, which can be an Indian way for conservation. But it becomes very fraught with other meanings of politicization, of attribution to other meanings, of co-option. And that is where it gets much more challenging.
Thank you so much. And one more question, which has come up, that is it always like that development has to necessarily be at the cost of nature? Well, it's a very difficult question to answer. Professor Mahesh would like to throw some light on that.
My view is it's not important to answer questions. It's important to keep posing them. We are living in an age of solutionizing, answering. But the purpose of scholarship is to pose a problematic. It is to enable us to grapple with dilemmas. Let's illustrate it. There is a very fine work. In fact, it takes you back to all the issues you'll be tracing by Sabyasachi. He has retired as professor at Jamia. And Sabyasachi for many years did area work in place which very few people can go now easily. Abujma, Bastar, now known for all other reasons. And he later did a very interesting study in Simlipa, very well-known paper, Tiger and Honey, where he showed that the way the forest is looked at for management, for preservation is tigers. From 1972, you count the number of tigers. Now they're very technologically sophisticated counting tigers. More tigers, the forest, the field director probably gets a promotion or maybe an extra jeep. Lots of tiger cubs, maybe their photo will come in, National Geographic. And the tiger as predator becomes the keeper of order in the forest. 100 years ago, or let's say 1870s, 1920s, it's the opposite. You eliminated the tigers, the forest was supposed to be ordered. So actually, you've simply inverted the imperial idea. It's not a new idea. It's the same idea in new form. He then has done very interesting work. Hill Karyas who are in the forest, these are people who are more than one day away from a road. And Sabyasachi has argued people who live one day away from a road are very important. They are not having, access to the benefits of what historians have called the metabolic rift. See, the metabolic rift is all that energy of sunlight stored in fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas. That gives us a lot of, joules of energy. If you're dependent only on human and animal muscle power, you will have very limited energy. Now, these people see the forest in terms of honey. For them, the key creature is the honeybees. They have divided the forest in terms of different kinds of honey. And they tell you which part of the forest you're in going by the taste of honey. Now, honey is highly seasonal. So they have to protect what they call the Madhu Bhandars. These are very ferocious local varieties of bees. They will sting you. They harvest the honey. So here it's a notion of productive use with a continuing presence. And one of the advantages of India is compared, let's say, to China, is many of these systems endure despite enormous pressures of government and markets and cultural transformations. They have reinvented themselves. Can we learn from them? That is the deeper question. And we are facing, it is true, a question common to industrial civilization. Can development and nature go together? We don't know. But keeping this safe, habitable, productive environment, there's no option. And just as democracy at one time had to expand to include women, people of so-called lower castes and tribes, people who didn't have property, can you have a democracy of nature? Because now that those knowledges and practices are very critical. We shouldn't romanticize them. All of them are not good, but there might be a lot more to learn from them than we think. And I think this parallels what Professor Nagendra has said about, Murunka and many of these trees being grown. These slums, which are regularly seen simply as destructive, may actually be harboring a variety of biodiversity not available in the urban park, which may have ornamentals and exotics. So I think, if we change the way of thinking, then we can pose this question better. I don't pretend to have an answer. It's very difficult. We're all trying.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's a hand up by somebody.
Yeah, Badrinarayan, his hand is up. Devender, you can ask him. Badri, you can unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. Since a lot of people here are railwaymen, I have a specific example, and which is typical. This is about project design and execution. What happens is you design a project and you find that there is a portion of which will require some clearances because there is a lake or mangroves or something like that. You leave that aside and you go ahead with the project. And you do everything else, and then at at that point, when everything else is done, you say, now I want clearance for this. And then people ask for an EIA and all that. It's almost a fait accompli by then, because you can't change the alignment on the either side of the thing. And so then you say, okay, you replace these mangroves or put them somewhere else, or do something. You talk about compensatory stuff, which surely is not going to help, because I'm sure the location of the mangroves is critical to what they do and stuff like that. So there, so many times I've seen, because the managers or project officers pushing for something which they also realize is damaging the environment, but it's too late for anyone to do anything because they have gone ahead with everything else. So this is a typical conflict that I just wanted to get your comments on. Hi, Mahesh, by the way. Hi.
Hi. Padri was, captain of a local football team. So I will settle the score with him later. That is when we were much younger and more energetic. There's a very interesting case. Yesterday I was on a panel, listening to a panel on the tiger, and Milind Parivakar, a biology student who worked in conservation, worked with some of the best NGOs. He described 15 years of a case of the NH7, National Highway 7, and it was going to intersect the Kana Pench landscape. So there are a lot of tigers in India compared to the rest of the world. Lots of those tigers are in central India. And central Indian landscape, there are 300 such projects. Of those 300, there are 5 which are critical. Of the 5, this was one of them. It took 15 years for them to work out, in this case, whether they would realign the national highway or they would put in mitigation in parts of the national highway. And one of the things he shared, which actually echoes Patri's remarks, is that every time in the 15 years, when they went before the National Wildlife Board, there was National Highway Authority of India, there was this gaggle of these very energetic characters, biologists, wildlifers, local activists, communities. Every time, whatever standards they were asking for kept getting diluted. They managed to get something through. So it was a bit of a victory. However, the same thing is happening now with the Satpura Maikal Hills landscape, identical story. So this is a very important point, and I think there is an issue of what is called a linear way of thinking. So Devenji was quoting no such thing as a free lunch, attributed to Milton Friedman. But this was drawn upon by Barry Commoner, and Barry Commoner famously argued that in nature, all things are interconnected. So the linear way of thinking, the interconnections vanish. So there is a certain way of thinking underlying it. In fact, you have described beautifully a railway line or a road is a linear project. Let me illustrate with a better example. My very good friend Ravi Agawar, by the way, trained as an engineer, has a fantastic paper on the ridge and the river. And he starts always by asking people in Delhi if they've traveled on something called the ring road. And everybody says yes. Then he asks how many of you got stuck on the ring road in the monsoon. Everybody raises their hand. And he asks why. They say, the drains were silted, the river came out of the drain, it came out of the road. And by the fourth why, you get to a fantastic chart. Much of the ring road is built on what are in North India called nalas. Now, nala doesn't mean drain. Nala is the watercourse. It's a seasonal watercourse which fills up with water in the monsoon and is dry the rest of it. Why did they build it in the nalas? Because this was an area without land rights, probably. It's easiest to put it through. Now, in the post-independence era, we have continued to build the roads in the nalas. So I think there is one is design obliterating very critical parts of natural assets or heritage, mangrove, forest, tiger corridor. That's one part. But the other part is fascinating. I mean, it's not rocket science to know that in an area with a sharp divide of dry and wet spells, in the wet season, you will have a lot of precipitation. Some years, the water in the watercourse will go up not twofold, threefold. We all know this, 30, 50, 100 fold. It's going to happen once in 30, 100 years. Why then are these projects put in the low-lying areas? It's a very simple question. I don't have the answer. And believe me, it is much more serious now than simply a road getting flooded a few months. We are all lived through floods in Mumbai, Chennai, Bengaluru, Delhi. So this ability to deal with water in places with this sharp, wet, dry river, which historically seems to have been present in city building in India. In this period of the metabolic rift and modern technology, it's been unlearned. actively unlearn. I would argue we should use the word active unlearning as a means to spur ourselves to think afresh. It's not that people don't know. Of course they know. How could you not know this? It's not rocket science, as they say. I don't have an answer, but this ring road instance is very important. Why are the roads being built in the nalas? Why is the low-lying area being urbanized? Are you really telling me people didn't know? I think they knew, but they decided it doesn't matter. And now it's going to matter more. It's going to matter more because for reasons beyond our control, it will expose even people who have invested capital to a lot of risk. So in the last few years, something fascinating has happened. Insurance people, actuaries, bankers, fund managers have become very interested in this question. They're really interested. This is a major area, climate change finance. So I suppose to finance your way out of this question, I don't think that's possible. So can we understand how these systems work? Because some elements of the system are not in our control. You can't prevent it, but you can adapt it. So I think that adaptation can be built in. That's the real, very big challenge. It's right now just staring us in the face.
Thank you. Right, Professor Mahesh. I go for nature walks and birding around Delhi throughout, this 365 days, and it is so painful to see that most of the water bodies and all the wetlands are vanishing in the name of fishing, and then you are taking out water, and then you are started cultivating them. Everyone knows that what is happening, but as I said, that greed, selfishness, apathy, they are the greatest moving traits as far as humans are concerned. And sometimes that disbalance takes place. And the tendency to hoard and tendency to have more and more, and we don't know the limit of what is more for us. So it is something which development and nature, we all have to tackle jointly. As you said, everything is interdependent, everything is interlinked, everything is connected to everything. I'll just give you an example of Sariska. By 2004, 28 tigers of that tiger reserve were, poached by one person, and he died of cancer. And by the time the population of the antlers population went up so hugely that it started affecting the fields which were outside Sariska because there was no food inside. And then the tigers were again introduced in 2009, and then the situation is controlled. So these are sporadic, one of the specific items which are pointers that what one can do, and what actions and what results and consequences a small action of human activity can result, which is counterproductive for the human themselves. And that realization is very, very essential. So the awareness which needs to be spread is very essential at all levels. At all levels. As I told you, that if I ask somebody that if you are a family of 4, how much oxygen are you consuming in a day? 99% don't know. So it's almost 2,500 liters you are consuming every day. And what are you returning? Nothing. Rather, you are hell-bent to cut trees, to cut all wetlands, to destroy everything which is nature for something very, very petty, or something where there is an alternative is existing. As Mr. Badri Narayan was also trying to tell, Panna Tiger Reserve, the railway line was going through it, and somebody got a survey that it can go through. Now, after sustained efforts, it is now going at the periphery. So it's not that everything cannot be, achieved by sustained actions, but someone has to be aware, and then action has to be taken in that direction, so that corrective action and corrective measures can be taken.
Devender, we might have missed one question. I don't know whether it is addressed or not. The worst victims of environmental destruction and its evil consequences are the poor and the people whose life is environment itself. Sadly, they do not even know that they're fast and fastidiously destroyed by the moderns. How to solve the complicated conundrum in a simple but practical way?
Yeah.
To both the panelists and also including you as a moderator, I pose this question. this is by somebody else.
I think
Yeah,
we are seeing this in the Pakistan floods right now. And I was just listening and looking at Twitter and a series of tweets about this, including by someone working in the UN who is very distraught that a lot of the work she's been doing supposedly at climate adaptation is not addressing the people. I think we will see this more and more in the next 20 years, that the places and people who have done the least to create climate change problems are the ones who are going to be affected the most. But I am afraid there are no simple solutions. I mean, if it was that simple, we would have addressed it a long time ago. And the solutions are going to be harder and more complex as we go on, because even if you think of something like tree planting in India or moving to solar energy, which are things we are doing and we should be doing, they come with challenges, and the worst impacts of those will be actually the poor and the dispossessed. In the long term, things will probably get better, but in the short term, they will get a great deal worse for people who are already impacted. And I think this is something that we have to think through very carefully. There are no right answers and wrong answers. And I see the problem, but unfortunately, I think the process of looking for quick solutions has led us this year. And we have to probably embrace the fact that it is a complex problem.
thank you. Thank you.
Professor Mahesh, would you like to respond?
Well, I think we go back. You see, there's a lot of work on this. Now I'll speak as a citizen, since we're speaking about present and future. If you look at the work of Thomas Piketty, there was a movement from around the 40s right up to 80s in democratic societies to reduce the levels of inequality. That included a lot of attention to issues of housing, water, sanitation, health, education, though this was more pronounced in the developed Western countries. But I'm sure that if one were to expand your question, and my colleague Mukul Sharma has written a very important book, Caste and Nature, where he looks at sanitation, water, access to commons, particularly of what were earlier used other terms now called themselves Dalits, scheduled castes. There is no doubt at all, not only they, but several others. And very broadly put, we have in countries like India, development of capitalism when most people have no property. I want to emphasize it. They don't have any property rights. So what is the answer? Endowing them property rights? Part of the answer. But that's not the only answer. There has to be some recognition of right to livelihood in active form. You're seeing this right now in the coast. I don't know if you're noticing, a lot of the ports, harbors, docks, which were developed often out of public exchequer, have been acquired by a major industry. Now, whether it's a state-operated, private-operated, the expansion of these ports, docks, harbors will have very important implications for the marine fishery and people who depend on the waters for a living. And if you look at the 6-8 million fisher folk who are along the seacoast, they are historically a highly mobilized group. And there's a remarkable book, since this conversation sounds a little depressing, let me say something nice, by Ajanta Subramanian on shorelines. And it looks at, Tamil Nadu and Kanyakumari. And she shows how the fishers come together and they assert their rights as a community. And there are notions of closed seasons, open seasons for fishing. And there is an effort to limit the trawler fishing of the waters. But can we guard the integrity of the coastline? I think the coastline is very critical today, not only in terms of climate change, but for those who live and depend on that perimeter of the sea and the coast. So this is a very important test for democracy in India. Can we have ecology as if democracy mattered? Can we have democracy as if ecology mattered? Is democracy, one of the fears with democracy when it came is it will be dominated by the dominant landed castes. This is a big fear. It's still legitimate, but you will all agree to some extent their powers have got diluted by other political changes. Can democracy survive plutocracy? That's really a question not only confronting India. I put it again, many of the Western countries confronted, but here, many of the underclass are exposed to a much greater degree of environmental risk, not only in terms of seasonality, but in terms of basic safety, but also in terms of life. We haven't looked at it, but one of the points which emerged in Anil Agarwal's work, he was one of the first to emphasize it 40 years ago, is that a huge amount of this environmental burden is borne by women who are poor. Enormous amount. The fetching of water, the fetching of firewood. So I think, so you have put a central question actually. Can we have democracy as an ecology matter and ecology as a democracy matter? I am an optimist. I think India is remarkably well placed. Indians are very well placed to try and rise to this challenge in different levels and walks of life. Now, whether that works or not, that's for us to figure it out.
I think Devender, we missed, I think, completed all the questions to my knowledge. If you find anything else, you can tell. Otherwise, we'll close.
Yeah. It was a wonderful talk and wonderful session. And what a great way to spend the Sunday morning. And both the professors, it has means I'm 100% sure that whosoever is listening to this talk, something is instigated in them, something is initiated in them, that something has to be done. There are very difficult questions, there are very difficult situations, very difficult circumstances. No answers are available, clear-cut answers are available, but we have to introspect at the macro level, micro level, and microscopic level, and take remedial actions wherever we can. And we don't have to be a passive spectators most of the time and only theoreticians. We need to have the practical aspect of everything which we are talking about or which we talked about today. And you know, some stark figures, the stats sometimes are dead looking objects, but they convey a great meaning. We are killing 77 billion animals a year. We are cutting 15 billion trees in a year. We are, you know, we are digging our graves and feeling very happy about it. It's a paradox to my mind. And as they say that we are a planet short. So we have to mend our ways, all of us, and at all levels, for sustaining the human population and to save nature so that that human population can survive. Do you know we were only 1 billion in 1804 and will be 8 billions in 2024. So let me put it that way, that the greatest development is happening, you know, in human growth as well as in electronic goods. The rest all seems to be on decline. So these types of sessions are a great reminder that we need to stop this, we need to halt this and reverse this pattern with awareness. And I thank Anekdhara, Ravi, Gagarin, Anil, and his team, Professor Mahesh and Professor Harini Nagendra, for this wonderful talk which we had this morning. And it will be something which can initiate a lot of thought process within all of us. Thank you. Over to Ravi.
Yeah, thank you, Devender. You've done my job. So my thanks to, first of all, my apologies for the technical glitch for both the panelists and also the audience. For some reason, this is the first session where we could not link to the YouTube directly. But other than that, but in spite of that glitch, I think we could manage to retrieve something, and then soon we'll upload the video on the YouTube and share it with everybody. So then that will bring in more audience. Now, my thanks to all three of you, Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, Professor Harini Nagendra, and my friend Devender, for readily accepting our request and then holding such a wonderful this one. In addition, thanks to all the audience. You had kept on waiting, seeing the message, waiting on the YouTube, but finally, all of you agreed to join here. Thanks to all of you. And apologies once again for keeping you waiting in the YouTube for some time. And then we also have a good technical team led by Sadiq Ali. My thanks to Sadiq Ali and his team. And we have a young design team who has designed this logo and all the posters and other things. Mrs. Shreya Rao and Johara. Thanks to both of them. Finally, our next topic of the webinar, every month we announce at this session, is on the 25th September, again last Sunday of the month. That is Socioeconomic Development of the Underprivileged in Post-Independent India. So that's the next topic. So with this, I thank everybody and we can close the session. Thank you very much.